The dust of Redemption, Arizona was a language Jedediah Kane had learned to translate. A low-hanging haze meant the morning freight was late. A sudden swirl by the livery stable meant Old Man Hemlock was losing another argument with his mule. But the cloud boiling up at the end of Main Street, thick, yellow, and violent, spoke of just one thing: trouble. Jedediah felt it in the bones of his gun hand, a dull ache that had been his only reliable compass since he'd traded his Texas Ranger's star for a branding iron. He stood before the teller's window at the Redemption Bank and trussed the soft weight of his payroll in one hand, trying to ignore the instinct coiling in his gut. The bank was an oasis of cool, shadowed quiet. The air smelled of oiled wood, aging paper, and the faint floral scent of the teller's hair pomade. Outside, the sun hammered the alkali flats, turning the distant mountains into shimmering ghosts. Inside, the rhythmic clink of the telegraph key from the back office was the town's steady mechanical heartbeat. Jedediah pushed the canvas bag across the polished oak. For the Circle K, Mr. Gable. Gable, a man whose spine had been fused into a permanent question mark by decades of ledgers, nodded without looking up. "Morning, Mr. Kane. Good month for you, I trust. The cattle are fat and the creek's still running. Can't ask for more." Jedediah's voice was a low, gravelly thing, rusted from disuse. He preferred the company of horses to men. They demanded less and understood more. He was turning to leave when the world dissolved into noise and chaos. The batwing doors of the bank exploded inward, splintering off their hinges. Shouts echoed off the high ceiling. Glass shattered. The telegraph went silent, a sudden shocking cessation of the town's pulse. 3 men stormed in their faces, hidden by dusty bandanas, their movements economical and brutal. 2 of them herded the half-dozen customers against the far wall with the blunt persuasion of sawed-off shotguns. The 3rd man, however, was different. He didn't rush. He strolled in as if he owned the place, the silver spurs on his boots, chiming a jaunty, discordant melody on the marble floor. He was tall and lean, dressed in tailored black that seemed to drink the light. He wore no mask. His face was all sharp angles and cruel amusement dominated by eyes of a startling pale blue that missed nothing. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, a theatrical flourish in the way he swept his hat from his head, revealing a mane of dark, immaculately combed hair. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice a rich baritone that filled the room, silencing the whimpers of the terrified customers. "Apologies for the abrupt intrusion. This is a matter of fiscal redistribution. Your cooperation will be remembered. Your heroism will not." Jedediah didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, his body a statue of coiled tension. He had seen this man's kind before. Not a common road agent, but something more dangerous, a man who enjoyed the performance of violence. The leader's gaze swept the room, dismissed the cowering townsfolk, and then landed on Jedediah. The pale blue eyes narrowed, and a slow, knowing smile spread across the man's lips. It was a smile of recognition, and it made Jedediah's blood run cold. "Well, well," the outlaw purred, taking a step forward. "Look what the cat dragged in from the lonesome prairie. Jedediah Kane. I'd heard you'd gone to seed out here, but I must say retirement seems to agree with you." Jedediah's hand twitched, an involuntary memory of 1,000 draws. His Colt was holstered high on his hip, but the 2 shotguns were trained on the crowd. Any move he made would get someone else killed. He kept his hands open and away from his body. "You have me at a disadvantage, friend." The outlaw laughed, a sound that was both charming and deeply unsettling. "Oh, I am not your friend. And this," he gestured around the bank, "is not a disadvantage. It is the overture to a grand and terrible symphony. Silas Thorne at your service." He gave a mocking bow. One of his men was already behind the counter, stuffing banknotes into a leather satchel. Silas Thorne never took his eyes off Jedediah. He walked a slow circle around him, like a wolf inspecting a sheep it had already cornered. I know what you're thinking, Ranger Silas said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You're thinking you can take me. Maybe you can. But can you take my 2 associates before they turn Mrs. Gable and her little boy into a Sunday school lesson on the evils of pride? Jedediah's gaze flickered to the teller's wife and son huddled behind the counter. Fear had made them small and silent. The cold reality of the situation settled over him like a shroud. He was a wolf, yes, but they had put him in a cage made of innocent flesh and blood. Take the money and go, Jedediah said, his voice flat. Oh, the money is a trifle. Silas waved a dismissive hand. A gratuity for my men's time. I'm here for something far more personal. His eyes locked onto Jedediah's shirt pocket. With a flick of his wrist, he produced a Bowie knife, the blade winking in the dim light. He stepped forward, the point of the knife tracing a line on Jedediah's chest before hooking under the chain of the silver locket tucked away in his pocket. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, seized Jedediah. Everything else in the room faded. The money, the guns, the frightened people, they were all ghosts. There was only the pressure of that steel against his chest and the sanctity of what it threatened. No, Jedediah breathed the word, a raw tear in the silence. Silas's smile widened. Yes. With a quick, sharp tug, he snapped the chain and held the locket up to the light. It was a simple, heart-shaped piece of silver, tarnished with age and smoothed by the touch of Jedediah's thumb over countless lonely nights. An heirloom. How touching. He pressed the clasp with his thumb, and the locket sprang open, revealing the miniature, hand-tinted portrait inside. Ah, Sarah. Even more beautiful than I recall. Such a shame about the fire. So untidy. The mention of his wife's name on this man's lips was a violation that went deeper than any knife. A white-hot rage, pure and blinding, surged through Jedediah. He lunged, a feral roar tearing from his throat, but the butt of a shotgun stock caught him squarely behind the ear. The world exploded in a flash of white light, and the marble floor rushed up to meet him. As darkness claimed the edges of his vision, the last thing he saw was Silas Thorne standing over him, dangling the silver locket from his fingertips. The outlaw's pale blue eyes were filled with a triumphant, venomous glee. He wasn't just a thief. He was a ghost, a specter. From a past Jedediah thought he had buried, come back to desecrate the last sacred thing he had left in the world. The robbery wasn't for money. It was for him. And as Jedediah slipped into unconsciousness, one question burned through the pain, not just why, but how. How did this man know his wife's name? Jedediah came back to a world of pain and stale cigar smoke. The ceiling of Sheriff Brody's office swam into focus, a cracked plaster map of rivers that went nowhere. A wet cloth was pressed to the back of his head, and the coppery taste of blood was thick in his mouth. Easy, Jed, a voice rumbled. Sheriff Lucas Brody knelt beside him, his face a landscape of sun-carved lines and weary concern. Brody was a man built like an oak barrel, solid and dependable. But his eyes held the deep-set exhaustion of someone who'd seen too many good men do bad things and too many bad men get away with it. The doc says you'll have a headache that could stop a clock, but nothing's broken that won't mend. Jedediah pushed himself up, his vision tunneling for a moment. He ignored the throbbing in his skull. His hand went instinctively to his chest, to the empty space where the locket should have been. The hollow feeling there was worse than any physical pain. It was an amputation of the soul. He took it. Jedediah rasped, his voice raw. Brody, he took her picture. I know the sheriff, said his voice gentle. Gable told me everything. Said this fella Thorne knew you. Called you by name. Jedediah swung his legs off the cot and sat up, his head roaring in protest. The town of Redemption was a living thing, and through the open office window he could hear its frightened, murmuring voice. The robbery had torn a hole in the fabric of their quiet lives. A posse was already forming outside a disorganized cluster of ranchers and storekeeps, with more righteous anger than sense. They rode west. Brody continued watching Jedediah's face. Toward the Malpais. Smart. A man could disappear in that devil's backyard for a month and not see another soul. He's not trying to disappear. Jedediah said, his gaze fixed on the gun rack on the wall. His old gun belt was there, coiled like a sleeping snake. He'd hung it there 2 years ago, the day he'd bought his ranch, a promise to himself and to Sarah's memory that his killing days were done. This was a message. What kind of message? Jedediah stood the room, swaying for a second before his legs steadied. He walked to the window and looked out at the town he had chosen for its quiet anonymity. Redemption. The name had seemed like a promise. Now it felt like a cruel joke. The splintered boardwalks, the whine of the saloon's out-of-tune piano, the smell of dust and stale beer was all part of a life he had tried to build on a foundation of forgetting. A life Silas Thorne had just set on fire. He turned back to Brody. I don't know, not yet. But I'm going to find out. Jed, you can't go after them alone. Brody protested. This ain't a Texas Ranger affair. Let me get the posse together. We'll ride at first light. By first light, they'll have a 12-hour lead and a dozen different trails to choose from. Jedediah countered, his voice hard. A posse is loud and slow. They'll see you coming from 5 miles off. I'll travel faster alone. He crossed the room and lifted the gun belt from its hook. The leather was stiff, the brass on the buckle tarnished. He ran his thumb over the smooth walnut grip of the Colt Peacemaker, the weight of it familiar and terrible in his hand. It felt like shaking hands with a ghost. You're not a ranger anymore, Jedediah, Brody said, his tone pleading. You're a rancher. You have a life here. He took that life from me when he took that locket, Jedediah said, strapping the belt around his hips. The weight settled on him, a burden he had once carried with pride, then with regret, and now with a cold, clear sense of purpose. This isn't about the money. It isn't even about justice. It's about a man who walked into my life and took the one thing I can't get back. I'm not asking for your permission, Lucas. I'm asking you to keep the posse home. They'll just get in my way. Sheriff Brody stared at his friend, at the transformation that had taken place in the span of an hour. The quiet, grieving rancher was gone. In his place stood the man from the stories, Jedediah Kane, the ranger, who had hunted down the infamous Black Creek gang and brought back 4 men dead and 1 half-mad with fear. The weariness was still in his eyes, but underneath it, a flinty, dangerous light had been rekindled. What do you need? Brody asked, finally surrendering to the inevitable. My horse, a rifle, and whatever you know about a man named Silas Thorne. Brody shook his head. Name's new to me. But the way he operates, theatrical, cruel. It feels personal. He walked over to a dusty filing cabinet and pulled out a stack of wanted posters. He sifted through them, the paper whispering in the quiet office. Nothing. Either he's new to the territory or he's smart enough to not get his picture drawn. Jedediah nodded. It fit. Thorne was no common thug. He was a puppeteer, and the bank robbery had been the opening act of a play written only for him. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. Jed, Brody said, his voice heavy. Don't let this turn you back into the man you were. Sarah wouldn't have wanted that. Jedediah looked down at his gun hand, at the calluses from branding irons and fence wire that now lay over the deeper, older calluses from his Colt. The man I was is the only one who can get her back. He stepped out into the dying light of the afternoon. The sun was a bloody smear on the western horizon. The desert air was cooling, carrying the scent of greasewood and the promise of a cold, star-filled night. He didn't look at the faces of the townspeople who watched him walk toward the livery. He didn't want to see their fear or their hope. Their world had been shattered today, but his had been shattered 2 years ago. This was just a settling of old accounts, an echo of a violence he thought he'd outrun. As he saddled his buckskin gelding, a sturdy, dependable animal named Ghost, he thought of the locket. He could feel its absence over his heart, a cold spot that ached with a phantom weight. Sarah's face, captured in that tiny portrait, had been his anchor, his proof that there had been a time of peace and gentleness in his life. Thorn hadn't just stolen a piece of silver, he had stolen a memory. And for that, Jedediah would ride through hell itself. He swung into the saddle, the familiar creak of leather, a grim comfort. He turned Ghost west toward the jagged, broken lands of the Malpais, a place where the world looked unfinished, a landscape of raw rock and shadow. He rode not as a rancher or a citizen of redemption, but as what he truly was, a man with nothing left to lose, hunting a monster who knew his name. The Malpais was a land God had made in anger. For 3 days, Jedediah tracked Silas Thorn and his men through a maze of volcanic rock and sun-blasted canyons. The trail was faint, a scuffed stone here, a broken branch of mesquite there, but Thorn wasn't trying too hard to hide it. He was leading Jedediah on, leaving just enough of a trail to keep him coming. It was part of the performance, a taunt written across the desert floor. On the 3rd night, Jedediah made a cold camp in the shadow of a towering rock spire that looked like a skeletal finger pointing at a sky overflowing with stars. He chewed on a piece of jerky, the dry meat tasteless in his mouth, and thought about the past. He had spent his life chasing men, but this felt different. This wasn't about a crime, it was about a sin. The memory of Thorn's voice saying his wife's name was a spur that drove him onward, overriding the exhaustion in his bones and the fire in his head. He'd met Sarah in a small town just north of the border. He'd been tracking a killer, and she had been the town's schoolteacher. She was everything he was not: gentle, hopeful, full of a light that seemed to push back the darkness he carried inside him. She had seen past the ranger's star and the reputation to the man beneath. She had made him believe in a life beyond the gun. When he retired, they bought the Circle K, a piece of land with a running creek and a small, sturdy ranch house. For 2 years he had been happy. It was a quiet, simple happiness that felt more real than any victory he had ever won as a lawman. Then came the fire. It had started in the barn, a lantern knocked over by a spooked horse, they'd said. It spread to the house with the speed of a prairie fire. He had been out mending a fence on the far side of the property. By the time he saw the smoke and rode back, the house was a roaring inferno. He had tried to get inside, had fought the flames until his clothes were smoldering and his lungs were raw, but it was too late. He had lost her. The fire had taken everything, except for the locket he always carried, a gift from her on their first anniversary. So untidy. Thorn's word echoed in the silence of the desert. How could he have known had he been there? The thought was a venomous seed planting itself in the barren soil of his grief. The next morning, he found the first body. One of Thorn's men slumped against a rock, a single neat hole in his forehead. His horse and gun were gone, but the money sat in a neat stack on his chest, weighed down by a stone. It wasn't a robbery. It was a culling. Thorn was tying up loose ends, narrowing the cast of his play down to the principal actors. Jedediah followed the trail now made by only 2 horses, deeper into the broken country. He found the second man 2 days later at the bottom of a ravine, his neck broken. His share of the money was also left behind. Now it was just Thorn. One man leading another on a journey into the heart of a mystery. The trail led him out of the Malpais and toward the abandoned mining town of Diablo's Peak. It was a ghost town, a collection of skeletal buildings bleached by the sun, its mines played out decades ago. It was a perfect place for a final act. As Jedediah rode down the town's only street, the wind moaned through the empty windows, a mournful, lonely sound. The sign for the Golden Garter Saloon, swung on one rusty hinge, creaking a rhythmic protest against its own decay. He dismounted in front of the saloon, Ghost's hooves stirring up dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. He could feel it. Thorn was here. The air was thick with his presence, with the sense of a trap waiting to be sprung. Jedediah drew his Colt, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the silence. He pushed open the saloon doors and stepped inside. The interior was a tomb of forgotten revelry. Dust lay thick on everything, and cobwebs draped the tables like funeral shrouds. Light filtered through the grimy windows, illuminating dancing motes of dust. And in the center of the room, sitting at a poker table as if waiting for a game to begin, was Silas Thorn. He was alone. He looked up as Jedediah entered, a welcoming smile on his face. He was freshly shaved, his black coat brushed clean. He looked completely at ease. On the table in front of him, next to a bottle of whiskey and 2 clean glasses, lay the silver locket. "Jedediah Silas," said his voice echoing in the vast, empty room. "Punctual as ever. I was beginning to worry you'd lost the trail. Please have a seat. Join me for a drink." Jedediah kept his pistol leveled at Thorn's chest. "Give me the locket." "All in good time," Silas chided gently. "First, a civilized conversation. We have so much to discuss, 20 years of history to unpack." He gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit. Or I could simply put the locket on the floor and crush it under my heel. The choice, as always, is yours." The threat was quiet, but it carried more weight than a dozen shotguns. Jedediah slowly lowered himself into the chair, his muscles screaming with tension. He never took his eyes off Thorn, never let the barrel of his Colt waver. Silas poured 2 glasses of whiskey and pushed one across the table. "To reunions," he said, raising his glass. Jedediah didn't move. Silas shrugged and took a sip. "A shame. It's excellent whiskey." "What do you want?" Jedediah asked, his voice a low growl. "Want?" Silas chuckled. "I want what is owed. I want a balancing of the scales. I want you to understand the depth of the pain you and yours have caused." He reached into his waistcoat and pulled out a gold pocket watch, placing it on the table next to the locket. He clicked it open. Jedediah's blood turned to ice. He knew that watch, the ornate scrolling K engraved on the cover. It had belonged to his father, Marshal Franklin Kane, a man whose legend was carved into the history of the West with blood and iron. His father had lost it in a shootout just before he died. "Where did you get that?" Jedediah demanded. "It belonged to my father, Silas," said his voice, losing its theatrical lilt, replaced by something cold and hard as stone. "Before your father took it from his cooling corpse. Your father, the great Marshal Kane, the man they called the Judge of the Plains. A hero, they said. A man of iron will and unbending justice." Silas leaned forward, his pale eyes burning with a hate so pure it was almost beautiful. "He was a murderer, Jedediah. A butcher who dispensed justice from the barrel of a gun to any man who stood in his way." The pieces began to fall into place, forming a picture of horrifying clarity. "The Black Creek shootout," Jedediah whispered. "Ah, so you do remember," Silas sneered. "The official story was that your father and his posse cornered the notorious Miller gang. A fierce battle ensued, and my father, Elias Thorn, the supposed leader, was killed while resisting arrest. A clean, heroic tale for the penny dreadfuls." He took another sip of whiskey. "The truth is somewhat less tidy. My father wasn't a gang leader. He was a rancher who refused to sell his land to the railroad syndicate your father was secretly in the pocket of. So Franklin Kane declared him an outlaw, formed a posse of hired guns, and executed him and his ranch hands in cold blood. I was 10 years old. I watched from the hayloft as your father put a bullet in my father's back and then took his watch as a trophy." Jedediah stared at the watch, at the locket, at the man before him. His father had been a hard man, a man who saw the world in black and white law and chaos. But a murderer. A hired gun for the railroad. It was impossible. And yet, the attacks on his own ranch, which had begun subtly months before the bank robbery, a poisoned well, a deliberately cut fence line that scattered his herd, they had all targeted things connected, not just to him, but to the land itself. To the legacy his father's name had helped him secure. This wasn't just about a locket. This was about land blood and a debt that had been festering for 20 years. You've spent your whole life running from what he was, haven't you? Silas continued, his voice, soft, hypnotic. You traded his star for a ranch, trying to build a peaceful life on land paid for with blood money. You thought you could wash the stain of his sins away with honest sweat. But a son always pays his father's debts, Jedediah. It's the first rule of this world. My father was a lawman, Jedediah said, his own convictions sounding hollow in his ears. Your father was a tyrant who wrapped himself in a tin star, Silas spat. And I have spent the last 20 years planning how to make you feel what I felt that day. The helplessness, the rage, the agony of having everything you love burned to ash before your very eyes. He paused, letting the words hang in the dusty air. He looked from Jedediah's face to the locket on the table. The fire that killed your wife, Silas, said, his voice dropping to a chillingly calm whisper. It was not an accident. There was no overturned lantern. I was there, Jedediah. I watched your house burn. I listened to her screams. It was the first payment on the debt your father left behind. And it was exquisite. The world stopped. The saloon, the dust, the man across the table, it all receded into a silent gray void. There was only the sound of Silas's words replaying in his mind, each syllable a hammer blow shattering the foundations of his life. Sarah. His gentle, loving Sarah. Her death hadn't been a tragic accident. It had been a murder, an execution, the opening move in this monster's game. The rage that had been simmering inside Jedediah for 2 years erupted. It was a physical force, a white-hot nova, that obliterated thought, reason, and caution. He didn't scream. He didn't speak. He simply rose from his chair, his Colt coming up the hammer, already cocked, the world narrowing to the space between the front sight and Silas Thorne's smiling face. But Silas was ready. As Jedediah fired, Thorne kicked the table over. The heavy oak flipped into the air, absorbing the bullet with a deafening crack. The locket and the watch flew across the room. Whiskey sprayed. In the same motion, Silas drew 2 pistols from under his coat and fired not at Jedediah, but at the ceiling. Plaster and dust rained down. From the shadows of the second-floor balcony, figures emerged. At least 4 men, all with rifles leveled at him. It had been a trap all along. You see, Jedediah, Silas's voice called out from behind the overturned table, laced with manic glee. This is the difference between us. You inherited your father's violence. I perfected it. You fight with rage. I fight with a plan. Jedediah dove behind the long, solid wood of the bar as rifle fire splintered the spot where he had been standing. He was outmanned, outmaneuvered, and emotionally shattered. He was caught in a dead man's town in a game whose rules had been written 2 decades ago, and the only prize for winning was the right to die last. He chambered another round, the scent of gunpowder and whiskey filling his senses, and prepared to answer the ghost of his father's sins with a violence all his own. The saloon erupted into a symphony of destruction. Bullets tore through the dry wood of the bar, kicking up clouds of splinters that stung Jedediah's face. He fired back, not aiming to kill, but to suppress, to buy himself a second to think. The rage still burned in his gut, a solid core of heat. But the years of training, the instincts of 100 gunfights, took over. Rage would get him killed. Cold, methodical fury was his only chance. He's pinned down, one of the riflemen shouted from the balcony. Don't kill him, you fools. Silas roared, his voice sharp with command. I want him alive. I want him to watch as I tear down the rest of his world. Jedediah risked a glance over the top of the bar. 2 men on the balcony, 2 more taking cover behind the support pillars on the main floor. And Silas somewhere behind the overturned poker table. He was a cornered animal, but he wasn't a dead one yet. He saw the locket lying near the base of the staircase, its silver gleam a faint star in the dusty gloom. The sight of it focused his rage into a single, sharp point. He fired 2 quick shots at the balcony, forcing the riflemen to duck, then sprinted from behind the bar toward the kitchen doors at the back of the saloon. A bullet whistled past his ear, close enough to make the fine hairs on his neck stand up. He crashed through the swinging doors and into the darkness of the kitchen. The air was stale, thick with the ghosts of old grease and spilled beer. A single grimy window offered a sliver of light. He moved through the room, his boots crunching on broken glass. He needed a new position, an element of surprise. He found a narrow, rickety staircase leading up to the rooms above the saloon. It was a risk, it could be a dead end, but it was better than being a fish in a barrel. He took the stairs 2 at a time, and the old wood groaning in protest. He emerged into a long, dark hallway, lined with closed doors. He could hear Silas's men moving cautiously into the kitchen below. He's gone upstairs, a voice called. Spread out, find him, Silas commanded. Jedediah slipped into the nearest room. It was small, containing only a rusted iron bed frame and a shattered mirror that reflected a fractured, ghostly image of him. He moved to the window, which overlooked the town's main street. Below, tethered to a hitching post, were the gang's horses. And something else. A buckboard wagon, its canvas cover hiding its contents. Tied to the driver's seat, gagged and bound, was Sheriff Lucas Brody. The cold dread returned sharper this time. This wasn't just about him anymore. Silas had brought the war back to redemption. Brody must have followed him, must have ignored his warning, and ridden straight into Thorne's trap. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Jedediah flattened himself against the wall beside the door, his Colt held steady in a 2-handed grip. The door swung open slowly. A shadow fell across the floor. A man peered in, his rifle held at the ready. Jedediah didn't hesitate. He brought the barrel of his pistol down on the man's head in a swift, brutal arc. The man crumpled without a sound, 1 down. He stripped the unconscious man of his rifle and ammunition belt, a Winchester, a good, reliable weapon. He now had a choice. He could try to escape, circle around, and free Brody. But Silas would be expecting that. No, the performance had to end here, on this stage. He crept back into the hallway. He could hear 2 more of the men searching the rooms at the far end. Silas, he guessed, was still downstairs directing his puppets. Jedediah moved in the opposite direction toward the front of the building, to the room that sat directly above the saloon's main entrance. From its balcony window, he would have a clear line of sight down into the room below. He entered the room just as a massive gust of wind rattled the building. Outside, the sky had turned a sickly yellow-brown. The air grew heavy, charged with electricity. A sandstorm. The desert was coming to join the fight, to become another actor in this terrible play. Wind howled through the ghost town, peeling shingles from roofs and sending a river of sand hissing down the main street. The light inside the saloon grew dim, turning the world into a murky, chaotic twilight. Perfect. Jedediah kicked a chair over to the window, smashed the remaining glass out with the rifle butt, and looked down. He could see 2 of Thorne's men moving among the tables below. He saw the overturned poker table. But Silas was gone. A storm. Jedediah, Silas's voice boomed, seemingly from everywhere at once. The wind and the acoustics of the old building played tricks with the sound. How wonderfully biblical the heavens themselves have come to witness the final judgment of the house of Cain. Jedediah scanned the room. Where was he? Then he saw it. A flicker of movement by the main staircase. Silas was using the storm's noise to move to reposition himself. Jedediah brought the Winchester to his shoulder, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against him. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. One of the men on the floor below cried out and staggered, clutching his leg. Jedediah levered another round into the chamber, but before he could fire again, Silas burst from cover, his twin pistols blazing. Bullets chewed at the window frame around Jedediah's head, forcing him back. You see, Silas screamed over the roar of the wind. You cannot escape your father's legacy. You are an instrument of violence. It is all you have ever been. The storm was a living thing now, a furious, suffocating entity. Sand poured through the broken window, stinging Jedediah's eyes and grating between his teeth. The saloon was a maelstrom of wind dust and gunfire. Down below, he saw one of the riflemen dragging his wounded comrade toward the back door. The other two were laying down a hail of covering fire. Jedediah was pinned. He was running out of time. Brody was still tied to that wagon, exposed to the full fury of the storm. He had to end it. He had to force the confrontation. He stood up deliberately, exposing himself in the window. "Thorn!" He bellowed, his voice raw from the dust and the strain. "This is between you and me. Let the others go. Let Brody go. This debt is mine to pay." For a moment, the only answer was the howl of the wind. Then Silas stepped out into the middle of the saloon floor, directly below Jedediah. He held his pistols at his sides, his face a mask of ecstatic madness, his hair and clothes whipped by the wind pouring through the shattered doors. "It was never just about you, Jedediah," he yelled back. "It's about your name, your town. Everything you built to hide from the truth, I will burn it all to the ground. Just as I burned your home, just as I burned your wife." He fired both pistols upward. Jedediah ducked back as bullets splintered the floorboards at his feet. The finality of his situation was absolute. He couldn't win a shootout against 4 men. He couldn't save Brody from here. He had to change the game. He backed away from the window, turned, and ran. Not away, but toward. He raced down the hallway, down the back stairs, and burst back into the kitchen. The 2 remaining gunmen were there, helping their wounded friend. They turned surprised as he charged through the swinging doors. He didn't give them time to aim. He fired the Winchester from his hip. The blast sent one man sprawling. The other returned fire, his bullet gouging a long splinter from the doorframe next to Jedediah's head. Jedediah dropped the rifle, drew his Colt, and fired twice. The second gunman clutched his chest and fell. He ignored the wounded man on the floor and sprinted back into the main saloon. The storm was at its peak. The world outside the windows was an opaque wall of churning brown. Silas stood by the staircase, his pistols empty, a look of shocked fury on his face. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the cornered wolf to charge the pack. Jedediah advanced on him, his Colt rock-steady, his face a grim mask of dust and determination. "It's over, Thorn." Silas stared at him, his chest heaving. The theatrical mask was gone. All that was left was the raw, 20-year-old hate. He threw his empty pistols aside. No, not yet. With a sudden, desperate lunge, he scooped the silver locket from the floor. He held it up, his thumb on the clasp. "One more step, and I crush her face into dust." Jedediah froze 10 feet away. The storm raged around them, a fitting soundtrack for the ruin of 2 lives. "My father died begging for his life." Silas hissed, his voice cracking with emotion. "Did you know that the great Marshal Kane made him beg? I will not give you that satisfaction." He backed away toward the front doors. "But I will give you a choice. A final moral test for the son of the great lawman. Your friend the sheriff is outside. The storm will kill him in another 10 minutes. Or you can have this." He held up the locket. Her memory or his life? What does the great Jedediah Kane choose, justice or sentiment? He turned and ran out into the blinding storm. Jedediah stood for a heartbeat torn by an impossible choice. The locket, the last tangible piece of Sarah, the reason for this entire bloody affair. Or Brody, a good man, a friend who was about to die because of a feud that wasn't his. He looked at the carnage around him, at the bodies of Thorne's men, at the ruin of the saloon. This was his father's legacy, a trail of corpses. He would not let it claim another good man. He ran for the doors, out into the teeth of the storm, choosing the living over the dead. He chose redemption. The world outside was a roaring sandpaper hell. The wind tore at Jedediah, trying to rip him from his feet. Sand blasted his skin, filled his eyes, his mouth, his lungs. He could barely see 10 feet in front of him. He stumbled toward the spot where the wagon had been, his hands outstretched, feeling his way through the blinding chaos. He found the wagon, its canvas cover shredded and flapping wildly. Brody was still there, slumped in the seat, his head down. Jedediah fumbled with the ropes, his fingers numb and clumsy. The knots were tight, cruel. He pulled his knife and sawed at the thick hemp. "Lucas," he yelled over the storm. "Lucas, wake up." He cut the last rope and dragged Brody from the wagon. The sheriff was limp, barely conscious. Jedediah slung one of Brody's arms over his shoulder and began the agonizingly slow journey back toward the saloon, leaning into the wind, one painful step at a time. The storm was trying to scour them from the face of the earth. He half-dragged, half-carried Brody through the saloon doors and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, his lungs on fire. The storm's fury was slightly muffled in here, but the building itself seemed to groan under the assault. Brody coughed, spitting out sand. "Jed, you came back. Told you I'd travel faster alone." Jedediah rasped, forcing a grim smile, but his victory was ashes in his mouth. Thorne was gone, and with him, the locket. He had saved Brody, but he had lost Sarah all over again. He had made the right choice, the only choice a man of honor could make. But it felt like the bitterest defeat of his life. He stared out into the churning brown apocalypse at a world that had been wiped clean, wondering what, if anything, would be left when the storm finally passed. The sandstorm raged for another hour, a relentless primal scream that shook the foundations of the ghost town. Jedediah and Brody huddled behind the bar, sharing the last of Jedediah's water. Brody was weak, dehydrated, but he would live. He had a stubbornness that Jedediah had always admired. "He's gone," Brody said, his voice hoarse. "Vanished into that mess. You'll never find him now." Jedediah didn't answer. He stared into the swirling dust that filled the saloon, watching as the wind rearranged the debris of their battle. He had been so focused on the locket, on the symbol of his loss, that he had almost forgotten the truth that loss represented. Sarah was gone. A piece of silver wouldn't bring her back. But Silas Thorne was still out there, a cancer on the world, a man who had murdered his wife in cold blood. The locket no longer mattered. Only the debt remained. As the wind began to subside, its roar diminishing to a mournful moan, a new sound emerged. A faint, rhythmic creaking. Jedediah looked toward the sound. The sign for the golden garter, which had been swinging on one hinge, had finally been torn loose by the storm. It lay half-buried in a dune of sand that had drifted against the saloon's entrance. And beneath it, pinned by the heavy wood and iron, was a man's boot. Jedediah rose, his body aching with a weariness that went bone deep. He walked to the door, Brody struggling to his feet behind him. Together, they heaved the heavy sign away. Silas Thorne lay twisted and broken beneath it. The storm, the grand biblical witness to his judgment, had delivered its own verdict. His eyes were open, staring up at the churning sky, filled not with hate, but with a kind of profound surprise. His chest was crushed. A thin trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth, already turning to a muddy paste in the dust. In his hand, clutched so tightly that Jedediah had to pry his fingers open one by one, was the silver locket. It was dented and scratched, but intact. Jedediah took it. He didn't open it. He just held it in his palm, the metal cool against his skin. He looked down at the man who had orchestrated so much pain, who had burned down his world out of a twisted sense of justice. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a vast, empty sadness. Silas Thorne hadn't been a monster. He had been a boy, a 10-year-old boy trapped in a man's body, still watching his father die in a hayloft, trying to balance scales that could never be balanced. A son pays his father's debts, Jedediah said quietly, the words swallowed by the wind. He looked at Thorne, and for the first time he saw not the man who had murdered his wife, but another victim of his father's violent legacy. The cycle had ended here in the dust of a dead town, crushed by an indifferent act of nature. The journey back to redemption was slow and silent. They rode with Thorne's body slung over his own horse. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking the town, they saw that the storm had been hard on it. Roofs were damaged, windows were shattered, and a thick blanket of sand covered everything, softening the hard edges of the world. But it was still standing. The people were already emerging from their homes, blinking in the pale post-storm light, ready to sweep their porches and nail down their shingles, ready to rebuild. Sheriff Brody's funeral was 2 days later. The whole town turned out. He hadn't died in the storm, but his body, weakened by the ordeal, had succumbed to a lung fever the following night. He had died a hero, saving his friend. But Jedediah knew the truth. Brody had died because of him, because of a blood feud started before either of them had even set foot in redemption. Jedediah stood before the simple wooden marker in the town cemetery. The air was clean washed by the storm. In his hand, he held his father's tarnished Texas Ranger star. He had found it tucked away in a trunk, a relic of a life he had tried to forget. It was a symbol of a certain kind of justice, a hard, uncompromising law that left no room for mercy. It was the legacy that had cost him his wife and his friend. He knelt and placed the star on the freshly turned earth of Brody's grave. He wasn't rejecting his father, not entirely. He was choosing a different path. Brody's path. The path of a man who served his community not with fame and fury, but with quiet, stubborn decency. He was leaving the ghost of Marshall Kane here buried with a better man. He walked back into town, his steps feeling lighter than they had in years. The sounds of hammers and saws filled the air as the townspeople worked to repair the storm's damage. He passed the saloon where the owner, a weary but resilient woman named Maeve, was directing the replacement of a shattered window. She gave him a small, sad smile, an acknowledgement of their shared loss and their shared will to endure. He stopped in front of the carpenter's shop, which had lost half its roof. Men were working on the rafters, their silhouettes stark against the bright blue sky. Jedediah watched them for a moment. Then he walked over to a stack of fresh lumber, picked up a hammer, and climbed the ladder. He didn't ask. He just started working, his hammer blows falling in a steady, rhythmic beat, a sound not of destruction, but of creation. The sound of a man building a future instead of being haunted by the past. Later that evening, as the sun set and painted the rebuilt town in hues of orange and purple, he sat on the boardwalk outside the new doctor's office. Dr. Eris Thorne, a young, kind woman with steady hands and tired eyes, had come to town a month ago. She had done her best for Brody. She sat beside Jedediah, now sharing a quiet, comfortable silence. "I heard you got back what he took," she said gently. Jedediah nodded. He pulled the locket from his pocket. His thumb traced the dented heart shape. For days he had been afraid to open it, afraid the memory would be too painful forever, tainted by Silas Thorne's confession. But now, sitting here in the middle of a town that was healing, he knew he had to. He pressed the clasp. The locket sprang open. He looked down at the tiny portrait of Sarah, her smile as bright and gentle as he remembered. The image wasn't tainted. It wasn't a symbol of murder and revenge. It was just her. A memory of love, pure and untouched by the violence that had followed. It was a reminder not of what he had lost, but of what he had been lucky enough to have. Dr. Eris leaned over, looking at the portrait. She was beautiful. Yes, Jedediah said, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time in 2 years. She was. He closed the locket, the click of the clasp, a small final sound. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A quiet promise made in a town called Redemption.